Hey guys, this is Arya, and today I'm going to talk a bit about mistakes to avoid during product interviews. First, a brief about me. I'm currently a senior product manager at LinkedIn, part of the LTS business, and I work on messaging, notifications, and the Recruiter Lite product. Prior to this, I have had a pretty cross-functional background. So I have tried my hands at building a mobile product at Trinet. I was the head of marketing for Lex Insight, product and marketing strategy manager at Samsung, and also a project manager at P&G. My educational background, I did my BTech from IIT and my MBA from HPS. And I'm also a dad to an adorable 8-month-old. Before I get into the deck, I just wanted to share a small disclaimer that everything that I've put in here is based on my personal experience. So you should use the info here as more like guiding principles. And you should not forget to bring in your own strengths and your own approach to your interviews. That's super important. Now let's get to the actual content. I wanted to start with how to approach a product interview. And in my opinion, a product interview has three distinct components. The first component is what's the problem you're trying to solve for? The second component is how to solve for that problem. And the third is how do you take it to market? Uh, in terms of what's the problem and for whom, we talk about clarifying the question, identifying the problem space, defining user groups, and so forth. The second part is how to solve for it, where you actually define the solution and prioritize it. And under go-to-market, we talk about pre-launch, launch, and post-launch activities. So in my experience, I have felt that most people tend to cover the first two parts of the approach really well, but they miss the go-to-market aspect. And this is something that can really help you stand out. And I'm going to talk more about each of these in the next few slides. So starting with how to ask the right clarifying questions. And I have seen several people struggle even at the clarifying question stage. That how do you ask? Like what do you ask about a problem? And in such cases, I recommend to just use the question words to guide you, like who, what, why, when, where, and how. So usually when I interview, I would just write these words down on the board, and they help guide my thinking about what questions to ask. But a watch out here, do not use this as a checklist of questions to go through because that would be too much. But use your judgment to pick and choose which questions make sense in the context of that interview. Now the fun part, like how to think about the problem space to solve for. There are like many interviews that I have been a part of where the candidate, like when I asked them that how would you improve LinkedIn, they would start by focusing on a very small problem. For example, the user experience for this component is not very good, or there's a bug here that I've come across. I want you guys to remember that when an interviewer is asking you about how to improve a product, you should think as big as you can, like think billion-dollar ideas. And this is super important. In fact, you can even give the choice to the recruiter that I have several ideas that could be strategically important for the product. And I also have several tactical improvements in mind. So which one would you want me to focus on? And that can kind of help you cover whatever the interviewer is looking to find out from that interview. And in terms of thinking big, I gave two examples here around how to think about it. So for example, if you're interviewing for LinkedIn and someone asks you that how would you improve LinkedIn? One approach could be moving up the value chain for existing users. So if you think about the users for LinkedIn, recruiters are a very big user group. And if you take a look at the value chain for recruiters, it can be divided into talent management, employee engagement, core HR functions, and so forth. And there are many components to each of these sub-segments of the value chain. And if you take a look at LinkedIn, it's only covering the top of the funnel, which is hiring. So you can think of adjacent products to hiring that LinkedIn can offer. which would help it move in deeper into the value chain. The second approach could be extending the product to new users. For example, right now, LinkedIn is a product which is primarily catering to the white collar workforce. So maybe there is scope for us to grow it in the blue and gray collar workforce as well. So there could be some very interesting improvements that you can talk about in that segment. There could be many such dimensions. For example, geography could be another dimension to think about. And a bonus tip I would give you here to really stand out is to do some light user research before the interview. For example, before I went in for my LinkedIn interview, I wanted to propose that we should improve LinkedIn by building for the blue and gray collar workforce. But I realized that I did not have a very strong understanding of the needs of this segment. So I just put in an ad on Craigslist that I am looking to talk to some coffee shop owners, some construction workers, to understand what their needs are and how they look for work. And it probably took around 3 hours of my time and just a little bit of money. And it gave me a very deep understanding of the problems that this segment faces. And that allowed me to talk with confidence when this came up during my discussions. And I could tell that when I told my interviewer that I have actually interviewed a couple of users in this segment, and that has given me these insights, he was completely wowed because no one really does it, and it's something so easy to do. So that's a really important tip for you to stand out. The next part I want to cover is when to prioritize and how to prioritize. This is something that I have struggled with in several of my past interviews as well. So when I would go to an interview, I tended to end up with a situation that's shown on the right. So I identified a problem, then I'm trying to solve it for different users. So I would have user group 1, 2, 3, and then I would have needs for all of those user groups. So it tended to become a really large list, and I was trying to globally prioritize across this list. And it felt to me that I was often all over the place without being able to spend quality time on one segment of their needs. So now what I would recommend to you is to prioritize twice during the interview. The first is after you have defined the problem space, you identify all the potential user groups that are impacted for the problem space. So for example, for LinkedIn, it could be recruiters, it could be sales reps, it could be marketers, it could be professionals, and so forth. And out of these user groups, create an intelligent hypothesis why one group is more important than the others. So you don't need to do a lot of analytical stuff here, just pick one. Like, for example, you can say recruiters are the largest subsegment of the users that drive the highest revenue. So I think for the purpose of this interview, we can just focus on the recruiter segment. And then once you have prioritized to one user segment, you go to the needs of that segment. And then you do a second round of prioritization around the needs. And this would help you ensure that you pick one segment and you can go very deep into the needs of that segment and solve for it. This would really help you come out with a much more streamlined and much more concrete and coherent final outcome than if you just do a global prioritization. And this slide, I wanted to talk a little bit around how to prioritize. And this is also, I have personally struggled with in the past. So I talked to a lot of my friends who are in the product space in the Bay Area, and these approaches were actually recommended by some of those friends. I would suggest to prioritize based on the company that you're interviewing for and the time you have left during the interview. So let's say you are interviewing for a company where you don't have too much time in the interview. For example, LinkedIn, when I interviewed, they used to have 30-minute interviews. So in a 30-minute interview, you don't have a lot of time to go into a very detailed and analytical prioritization. So what I would suggest here is to do some type of a visual prioritization. So something like this on the left here, an impact versus effort. The benefit of this is the interviewer can very quickly see what you're talking about and which ones you're picking and why. So it's very easy to represent your ideas on this matrix, and it makes logical sense when you pick one idea over the other. Whereas certain companies have much more like longer interviews, if I can say. For example, I think Google has 45 to 60-minute interviews. And in those cases, since you have more time and you're focusing deeper into one problem, you may probably pick a more analytical approach to prioritization. So then you do your effort calculation, your impact calculation, get to the ROI, and then pick the ideas that have the best return on investment. None of these is better than the other. It just depends on the context where you are and how much time you have to spend on prioritization. And as you're talking through the different prioritization steps, I would recommend that you also talk through the trade-offs. Like if you pick one idea or the other, you need to talk through why that's a good idea and why you're discounting the others. And in terms of prioritization, another tip I would give you that I feel most people miss is how do you prioritize differently for blue ocean versus red ocean conditions? So in a blue ocean situation, you are first to market. You really have no strong competition. And the product you're building doesn't have any like strong peers. So you should focus on defining an MVP that helps you validate product market fit with minimum possible effort. Whereas if you're actually building for red ocean, where you have very strong incumbents, you have to prioritize for impact over effort. You have to build a product that has all the core capabilities of the incumbents, but also certain delighters that no one else offers. And I can guarantee you that if you bring this aspect of prioritization in your interviews, this is going to really impress whoever is interviewing you. And finally, do not miss the go-to-market plan to truly stand out. And this is something which I think is extremely important because as a product manager, in addition to building your product, a very important component of your role is actually ensuring the product succeeds. So you have to be very closely involved in taking a product to market. But this is what I would call is a cherry on the cake. So you should not spend a whole lot of time on this, but maybe 5 to 8 minutes during the interview. And I would divide this component into three broad buckets. One would be pre-launch, the second would be launch, and the third would be post-launch. In the pre-launch phase, you can talk about things around metrics. So what would be the North Star metric for you? What are some guardrail metrics you are going to take a look at? What are some funnel metrics that you are going to track? You can talk about the launch prep with different teams, like how would you work with legal to understand the legal implications? How would you work with sales, like different types of sales prep trainings that need to be developed? How would you work with the support teams to prepare them for the launch? How would you work with marketing, with PR teams to ensure that all the collateral is ready to go and all the GTM plans are properly worked out? How would you decide on the channel strategy? So which channels are you going to sell your product on? What would be the business model for each of those channels? So it's not like you have to do all of this yourself, but as a product manager, you need to be closely involved in these processes and work with all of these different teams to ensure that your product is completely ready for launch. The second part of the GTM plan is at the actual launch for the product. So at the launch phase, you need to do performance and metrics tracking. So how are you going to do that? You would probably set up dashboards, regular reportals. Like reportals are, I would say these regular reports that you can set up, automated reports. You will validate your hypothesis that you had going into the launch. You would ensure that your product is well supported. You will need to keep track of support requests that are coming in and ensuring that the SLAs for support are properly met. And you would work with your PR and marketing teams to ensure that all the stuff that you had prepped up for launch go through as per plan. And finally, your work doesn't end when you launch your product. So there is also a bucket of post-launch activities. So you would have your retrospective on what went right, what went wrong. You would collect user feedback to guide your future roadmap. And finally, you would talk about scaling. And I want to spend a little bit of time on it because this is something that nobody talks about in the interviews. And I can guarantee that if you talk about scaling, your interviewer's jaw is going to drop because this is something that every product manager has to work through. When you are building an MVP, you make decisions that help you very quickly validate whether the product you're building is the right product for the right audience, whether it has product market fit. So for example, if I'm building a video product for LinkedIn, let's say, I would choose architectures which would help me validate the idea very quickly, but they would have their limitations. For example, it could only support maybe 1,000 concurrent streams at once. But once you see that the product has achieved product market fit and you need to scale that product, you need to go back and completely rethink your architectural decisions around the product that you built at an MVP phase. So the same architecture that worked for 1,000 concurrent streams would not work when you're building a product that has to support 1,000,000 concurrent streams, maybe across 20 different geographies. So it's super important to think about how would you scale your product after you achieve product market fit. The second aspect could be around different geographies and localization. So how are you going to localize your product for different geographies? Is it just translating your product to different languages? Is it building localized capabilities for your products for those special markets that don't exist in your core market, and so forth? So there are a couple of dimensions that you can talk about on how you would scale your product after achieving product market fit. And this would really help you stand out in your interviews. This is the wow factor, and this is the wow takeaway that your interviewer is going to have from your interview. And finally, some closing thoughts. I would recommend that you take a few courses on UX and interaction design. In my view, good design sense is a core contributor towards good product sense. So you should spend some time on developing a good design sense. And this would also help you gain the respect of the designers you work with. You should learn as much as you can about A/B testing because this is the bread and butter of product managers. You need to understand how you should design experiments and how to interpret the outcomes of experiments. So if I ask you what a p-value means or what a p-value of 0 means for an experiment, you should know what it is. The third thing I would like to say is having a non-PM background is actually a very powerful strength to have in a PM, because my past experience has been across strategy, across marketing, across project management. And I have found that each of these skill sets have actually contributed a lot towards helping me become a very effective product manager. So do not discount your past experience if it is not in product management. It is actually one of your biggest strengths that you bring to the table. And finally, I would say that breaking into product management is hard. It takes time and effort. And it took me 3 years of trying to get my foot in the door. So if you're trying to break into PM and you don't have PM experience, do not give up. Just keep building your profile, learning more about product management, trying to do product related work in your existing roles. And I can promise you that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Some other useful resources I put in here could be helpful for you. There's a pretty good site called productvitamins.io, so you can check it out. Harvard Business School has a course called HPS PM 101. So they have some really good content here that you can check out. Reddit has a pretty good community around product management that I'm a part of as well. And there are some very helpful people here who are always kind of willing to guide people trying to break into product management. And finally, of course, product school, I think, is a pretty good program that you should take a look at as well. And I think that's all I had to talk about today. And I would like to stay on a bit and answer any questions that you guys may have. Thank you, and good luck for your search.